Alright guys, we are back. This is section B in the first part of 1917. Um, so we left it with the crowds outside the Tauride Palace. I've looked at the pronunciation now. And yes, we're going to ask what happened inside the Tauride Palace on Red Monday, as it's known, and why was it so significant? Um, so here it is, very important building, and the first thing that happens is on this left wing here. Well, I guess it may be this way, this way, depending on what way you're looking at it. But let's assume it's this wing here. We have the birth of the Petrograd Soviet of Soldiers and Workers. Now, this is a huge moment, an amazing image here of all of the delegates to the Soviet discussing what to do. Now, if you're a bit confused about what all of that just means, like I said, delegates to the Soviet, etc., we're going to have a quick recap on that. So, what was a Soviet? So, we know that it means council in Russian. The first Soviet, the first council, was formed in 1905 in response to the Russo-Japanese War in St. Petersburg, and that was because of the stress on those workers at the time to produce weapons and ammo and munitions to be sent for the war effort, and they weren't having it, so they organised themselves, and that's why it's so important here. So this is the first Soviet here on the right, and what was different about Soviets? Well, they were autonomous, so that means they made decisions for themselves that was not the government didn't ask them to form or to be represented. They represented themselves for their own rights, and obviously this is quite a radical development in Russian history, and also I guess in global history around that time. And once this Soviet had been established, various other Soviets throughout Russia sprang up. They sort of died down in their demands, mainly due to Nicholas II autocracy and the level of sort of censorship, etc. But they come back with a vengeance in 1917. And as I so often love about history, I mean, it's amazing the roles that people play. But Leon Trotsky, who obviously would go on to be one of the Bolshevik leaders, also happened to be the chairman of the first ever Soviet in St. Petersburg, which I just think's crazy to think, but yeah, that's history for you. Anyway, so that's what Soviet was. How did it function politically? I'll quickly go over this just so we can feel a bit more comfortable with it. So in a Soviet democracy, voters are organised by basic units. So, for example, there could be the workers of a company. It could be, as you see here, the inhabitants of a district. So it might be the Vyborg district would have their own Soviet, or soldiers in a particular barracks. They could make their own Soviet too, to represent their own interests to the people above them. And they would then send delegates as representatives to a larger Soviet above them. You're going to see in the next slide, got a little diagram there to sort of get that across to you. But at all levels, each Soviet acts as its own legislature, its own government, and as its own court, taking directives from the Soviets above them. I believe, I'm not 100% up on this, but so yeah, let's have a look here. We can see it here. So we would have the district Soviet, the Workers' Soviet, and the Soldiers' Soviet. They would send delegates up to the City Soviet. So in this regard, as we're seeing now, this image here would be made up of all of the representatives from all of the different Soviets on the bottom line here. Obviously, however many different factories there were in Petrograd, as we know, however many different soldiers, garrisons of soldiers, etc., and how many districts indeed there were. And so we can see here on the right, they'll go to the City Soviet, and then there would be delegates from all of the different City Soviets that were sent to a regional Soviet, and eventually those deputies would make their way up to the Congress of Soviets, which you should really sort of read Congress as as just the Soviet of Soviets, so it's the Council of Councils, and that Congress will go on to be later on, as you'll see, will function as the organising body, I guess, of the Bolshevik state. Very, very interesting. So on the right here, as we can see, we've got the first regional Caucasian Soviet. This represents what would be modern-day Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and obviously each Soviet would be have a particular party that it would be in line with, depending on the area's interests, or of course, the amount of factories they had in the area, etc. And this one particularly was overwhelmingly Menshevik. So why is it really important that this Soviet was formed? Again, sort of organically. Well, it was the only group in the city that had a direct connection with the workers and the soldiers, because obviously each person here as a delegate was representing a factory or a soldier's barracks, etc. So in the middle of this chaos, the anarchy in the streets that the February Revolution brought upon Petrograd, they were the only people in the city at that time that actually had the ability to send out a message and to quell the unrest, and that's really a key fact. So what do they do immediately? They have this very, very disorderly meeting. As you can see, it's not the calmest, most tranquil environment to have a meeting when your leader is out of the city and 500,000 people have been protesting for 4 or 5 days. So yeah, they immediately set up a food commissions. They want to improve the food supply. They create an organised militia to bring order to the streets, and they create the provisional, as everything is at this point, it's provisional because they're in between any form of power being established. They create a provisional central executive committee. It's also known as Ispolkom. This is made up of 6 Mensheviks, 2 Bolsheviks and 2 SRs, and 5 essentially independents. So in some ways it's quite a moderate executive committee, and this committee is the committee that will make decisions, or decide policy based on resolutions that are passed in the Soviet. And the first chairman, importantly, is, I just looked at the pronunciation of his name, Chekej, I think his name is, Menshevik, importantly, and the next chairman will be Menshevik too. So let's imagine here, got people running in and out, soldiers running in and out, telling people what's going on in the streets, new developments, but importantly, very few people know that this is currently happening. So this is in the left wing of the Tauride Palace. A question that many people ask, which is, well, why did the Soviet not, if there's a power vacuum and they're all meeting there and they're all organised, why did they not take power for themselves? Well, as we've just seen, the Central Executive Committee, or the Provisional Central Executive Committee, was made up mainly of moderates. So there were Bolsheviks around in the room, but all the leaders of the main parties, especially for the Bolsheviks, Lenin, Kamenev, Stalin, they are abroad, and Menshevik leaders are abroad as well. But what this means is that the Bolsheviks aren't very disciplined. They don't really know, as we say, it's a very chaotic environment, very difficult for anybody to sort of demonstrate any leadership at this point. So there aren't any leaders, and so we've got a moderate Central Executive Committee, and they believe that what's important is that this is the move into the bourgeois democratic stage of Marx's theory of development towards communism, and so they're happy to wait. They're happy to work with the bourgeoisie here. So what are the bourgeoisie doing? Well, as we know, the Duma, they've been close to power for the almost 15 years since the 1905 revolution, and they are trying their best to contact the Tsar. He obviously has his head in the sand, as he usually does. Rodzianko here is the leader of this Duma committee. So this is a committee that's been voted by what was part of the Duma, obviously, that had been dissolved a couple of days before by the Tsar. They realise they need order on the streets, and they obviously, Rodzianko sends messages to the Tsar that are increasingly fractious and really, asking him to appoint somebody. The Tsar famously replies, "That fat Rodzianko has written me some nonsense to which I will not even reply," which again is quite breathtaking ignorance from the Tsar. Maybe he got what he deserved. He's politically dead, as China Mieville says by this point. And so this Duma committee, they are the ones that, when I say take power, it's an interesting phrase here, but they're the ones that do become the figureheads, and they do assume power over the Soviets. Shulgin, one of the ministers, explains why, because obviously they said, well, if we don't take power, then the others will, those who have already elected some scoundrels in the factories, which again demonstrates the kind of attitude of the sort of bourgeoisie, or this liberal propertied class that had been constituted in Russia for a long time, and they declared that they were going to take into their hands the restoration of state and public order and try and respond to the population's desires. Interestingly, the only man in both, here he is here, Kerensky, the only man in both sides, so the only man in the Soviet as a socialist, and the only man in the Duma committee, or the I guess it is the Duma, they're also known as that at this point, is this man Alexander Kerensky, an ex-lawyer, so very used to advocating, very theatrical, very good at making speeches. As Catherine Merridale, who wrote Lenin on the Train, said about him, he is very much a forerunner of later politicians. Even people like Hitler. He was very good, very theatrical movements with his hands, very good at public speaking, and he crucially provides the link between these two wings of the Tauride Palace. So he is constantly moving back and forth between the two, and goes on to become prime minister, as we know, and has a key role in what later happens with the Bolsheviks. Kind of feel sorry for him, but again, he brings it upon himself too. So, just before we get to the end of this part, 15 minutes, not too bad. So, how is it going to work then? Because the Soviet is the one that has the power, because they're the ones that can all actually contact the people in the street. How does it get set up? And the Duma know this. So the Soviet draws up a list of demands of support, in which they will only support the Duma if the Duma agrees. We can see here again elements of how progressive and forward-thinking and amazing that this revolution was, and why it's such a shame that it didn't go the way, didn't develop any further from here, due to various people. But so we can see their demands. Number one, amnesty for political and religious prisoners. So freeing anybody that's been put away by the Tsar or before, on grounds that were completely baseless. Freedom of expression, publication strikes, again, thinking about autocracy, thinking about censorship. No wonder they're asking for this, and they clearly deserve it. Number 3, introduction of a democratic republic by universal, equal, direct, secret. Again, still male here. It's a shame they didn't push it even further forwards, but this is still 1917, so this is incredibly radical still. Well, the other demands are radical, but they want a constituent assembly. What is a constituent assembly? It's another name for essentially a parliament, I guess. A true parliament that's actually been voted for by various different parties have been voted for in a fair election. That's not had people like Stolypin and changing the rules for the franchise, etc. They want to replace the police force with a people's militia. So again, sort of re-envisioning the state here. So we don't have an arm of the state. The people police themselves. Interesting. They want elections again, as they would do, considering what's been their lot previous to this. Number 7, fantastic demand, abolition of discrimination based on class, religion or nationality. So again, very, very, very progressive. Number 8, self-government of the army. We're going to see a little bit further into this one in the next section, the final section on this first part. Number 9, again, very, very, very important. And also we'll look at this in the next section, but no withdrawal from Petrograd or disarmament of revolutionary army units, which is more or less all of the army units in Petrograd at that time. And so, just to sort of see how the two sides start to meld here, the Duma creates what it calls a military commission. What that essentially means is that they are taking control of the military, or that they want to be the ones that make the call. And obviously the Soviet, being the ones that actually have the power to organise the soldiers, send out a leaflet saying to the soldiers, look, the Duma are going to send out an order and we want you to follow it. Which again really shows the balance of power here. Why do they say that? And they tellingly in their leaflet they say, we do not wish to disturb the struggle against the old power. Disturb the struggle obviously means they see this as part of a longer term playing out of history, in which eventually they will move through this bourgeois democratic stage and take power eventually. Because of this, then, so the soldiers do follow the Soviets' directive. They do come under the control of the Duma's military commission, and then because of this, the railways are taken control of, which means therefore the Tsar is now in the grasp of this new, soon-to-be announced government, which is kind of hammering out the details still, and the telegraph and postal service is taking control of, which essentially sends out the message to the rest of what is soon to be a Russian Republic of what's happening in Petrograd, and this is what kicks legitimizes a lot of especially peasant activity from here in the rest of the country, obviously taking back land, etc. Interestingly, just to finish this last part, Kronstadt, I'm not going to be too long. So Kronstadt, as we know, they were already featured in 1905, but they play a key role. So the Kronstadt sailors, they live on this island here. It's facing to Finland. It's to protect St. Petersburg here, but they are going to play a very important later role. And on the 28th, so the day after all of this that's happened in Petrograd, that without even knowing, they stage their own revolt. They take their governor out. They execute him. They disobey his order to stand down, and yeah, I find this quite incredible that again, another quirk of history. They have no idea and they stage their own revolution themselves. Important to mention that Kronstadt sailors are all very radical. They're mostly Bolshevik. Some are SRs. A lot of them are even anarchists, so don't even believe in the state at all. And their story's kind of really quite an important case study, because they're there in the July days, so they're there adding their weight as sort of militant and radical contributors to the overthrow of the provisional government later in the July days. They are there in October when they sail into St. Petersburg by the Winter Palace and fire the blank cannon from the Aurora, their ship, which signals the taking of the Winter Palace. And most importantly, once the Civil War starts, so there is a Civil War just around the corner for you guys, and in that Civil War, the Kronstadt sailors actually rebel against the Bolsheviks because they don't agree with, that's not what they put their weight behind. And Trotsky, amazingly, brutally, actually goes to Kronstadt and puts them down and destroys them, which is a very important moment. But anyway, that's section B, 20 minutes, a lot of information. We're going to be coming up to the last section now. Hopefully won't be as too long. But yeah, thanks a lot, guys.